In 1901, sponge divers pulled a lump of corroded bronze from a shipwreck off the coast of a small Greek island. For decades, it sat ignored in a museum drawer, dismissed as a broken piece of statue. When scientists finally X-rayed it, they found something impossible. A hand-cranked machine with more than 30 interlocking bronze gears, built to model the motion of the sun, the moon, and the planets, and to predict eclipses decades in advance. Nothing of comparable complexity would appear again for over 1,000 years. In the ruins near Baghdad, archaeologists found a clay jar holding a copper cylinder and an iron rod. Fill it with vinegar, and it produces an electric current. It was made around 2,000 years ago, more than a millennium before the invention of the battery. In the courtyard of a mosque complex in Delhi, there is a pillar of solid iron nearly 7 meters tall. It has stood exposed to the monsoon rains for 1,600 years. It has never rusted. Modern foundries still cannot easily reproduce it. And in a rare book library at Yale University, there is a manuscript of 240 pages, filled with an unknown script and drawings of plants that do not exist. The parchment has been carbon dated to the early 15th century. In more than a century of study by cryptographers, linguists, and now artificial intelligence, not a single word has ever been read. These are not myths, they are not hoaxes. They are real objects, sitting in real museums, examined by real scientists with electron microscopes and radiocarbon labs. And every one of them raises the same uncomfortable question. How did people, centuries or millennia before the technology should have existed, make these things? This is our countdown of 10 ancient objects that should not exist for the time they came from. Objects so precise, so advanced, or so strange that even now, science cannot fully explain them. Stay until the end, because number 1 is that bronze machine from the shipwreck, and what it reveals about the ancient world is still rewriting the history of technology. Before we start, drop a comment telling us where you are watching from right now. We want to see how many countries this video reaches. Number 10. The Phaistos disc discovered at the Minoan Palace of Phaistos on the island of Crete. In 1908, an Italian archaeologist named Luigi Pernia was excavating the ruins of a Bronze Age palace when he unearthed a small disc of fired clay, roughly 16 centimeters across. Both sides were covered in symbols, spiraling inward from the edge to the center. There were human figures, fish, birds, plants, tools, and shapes that resemble nothing at all. 45 distinct signs, repeated across 242 characters. It dates to around 1700 BC, nearly 3,700 years ago. For over a century, the local story was that it was simply decorative, or a game, or a prayer. But the closer scholars looked, the stranger it became, because the symbols were not scratched into the clay by hand. Each one was pressed in, using a carved stamp, a separate seal for every one of the 45 signs. The maker stamped the same symbols over and over. That detail is what breaks the timeline. Pressing reusable, movable stamps into a surface to reproduce text is the fundamental principle of movable type printing. It is the idea Johannes Gutenberg is credited with inventing in Europe around 1450 AD, an invention that transformed human civilization. The Phaistos disc, that same principle, more than 3,000 years earlier. And then, as far as we can tell, the technique was never used again. The signs themselves have never been read. The script matches no known writing system. It is not Linear A, the undeciphered language of the Minoans. It is not Linear B, the Mycenaean Greek that was successfully cracked in 1952. It is not Cretan hieroglyphics. It stands completely alone, and there is a mathematical reason it may never be solved. With only 242 characters in total, the text is simply too short. There is not enough data for any statistical analysis to find a pattern, So we are left with an object that used a printing concept 3 millennia ahead of its time, to record a message in a language that exists nowhere else on Earth, and that no human being alive can read. The stamps that made it have never been found. Whatever it says, and whoever it was for, was pressed into wet clay and then, it seems, deliberately forgotten. Number 9. The Roman dodecahedron found scattered across the northern edges of the Roman Empire. Picture a hollow object made of bronze, about the size of an orange. It has 12 flat pentagonal faces, and in the center of each face is a circular hole, every hole a different size. At each of the 20 corners sits a small, rounded knob. It is beautifully made, perfectly symmetrical, and utterly without explanation. Around 130 of these objects have been found, almost all of them in the northwestern provinces of the empire, in Britain, France, Germany, and the Low Countries. They date mostly to the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. In June of 2023, an amateur archaeology group digging near the village of Norton Disney in Lincolnshire, England, found one of the finest examples ever recovered. At 8 centimeters tall and 245 grams, it was complete and undamaged after 1,700 years in the ground. Analysis showed it was cast from an alloy of roughly 63% copper and a surprisingly high 27% lead. Here is what makes it a genuine mystery, rather than just an unusual artifact. In the entire body of Roman literature, thousands of surviving texts covering engineering, warfare, cooking, religion, and daily life. There is not one single mention of these objects. Not a description, not a diagram, not even a passing reference. The Romans wrote down almost everything. They did not write down this. Theories have piled up for 2 centuries. Some say it was a surveying instrument for measuring distances. Others argue the holes are the wrong sizes and placements for that. Some propose it was a device for calculating planting dates, or a candle holder, or a tool for knitting gloves. Others believe it was a religious or ritual object, a theory the Norton Disney find seems to support because it was placed carefully in a pit alongside 4th century pottery, as if it mattered. The truth is that no theory fits all the evidence, and none has ever been proven. These objects were expensive to make. They took real skill, and they were spread across an entire corner of the ancient world. People clearly valued them, and yet the reason they existed died with the Romans who made them. We are holding the answer in our hands, and we cannot read it. Number 8. The Iron Pillar of Delhi, standing in the courtyard of the QTB complex in India. It is a single column of wrought iron, 7.2 meters tall, weighing more than 6 tons. An inscription on its surface, written in Sanskrit, credits its creation to the era of a king named Chandragupta, placing it at around the 4th century AD. That makes it roughly 1,600 years old. For all of those 16 centuries, it has stood in the open air, exposed to the searing heat of the Indian summer and the drenching humidity of the monsoon. By every rule of chemistry, it should be a pile of rust. Iron exposed to moisture and oxygen corrodes. It is one of the most reliable processes in the natural world. A modern iron column left outside for even a few decades would show heavy rusting. This pillar, after 1,600 years, is almost pristine. For a long time, this was treated as folklore or exaggeration. Then, in 2003, a team of metallurgists led by Professor R. Balasubramaniam at the Indian Institute of Technology in Kanpur published a detailed analysis, and they found the answer. The ancient iron contains an unusually high level of phosphorus, close to 1%, far more than modern industrial iron, which deliberately removes it. That phosphorus, combined with the specific forge welding techniques the ancient smiths used, allowed a thin, protective film to form on the surface of the metal. The scientists identified this film as a compound of iron, oxygen, hydrogen, and phosphorus, sometimes called misawite. Once formed, it seals the surface and stops the corrosion from going any deeper. So in one sense, the mystery is solved. We know why it does not rust. But that only deepens the real question. The ancient Indian metalworkers had no concept of phosphorus, no theory of corrosion, no chemistry as we understand it. They produced, by hand in the 4th century, a grade of corrosion-resistant iron that the modern world did not deliberately engineer until the 20th. They did it at a scale of 6 tons in a single piece, using charcoal furnaces and hammers. The film is real. The chemistry is verified. But the knowledge that produced it was never written down as knowledge. It was carried in the hands and the instincts of craftsmen who have been dead for 1600 years, and it stands in that courtyard today, quietly refusing to decay. Number 7. The Lycurgus cup, held today in the British Museum in London. At first glance, it looks like an ordinary, if exquisitely carved, Roman drinking cup made around the 4th century AD. It shows a scene from myth, King Lycurgus of Thrace being strangled by grapevines. But the cup does something that no other surviving Roman object can do. When you light it from the front, it glows a deep jade green. When you light it from behind, so the light passes through the glass, it transforms into a glowing, translucent blood red. This property is called dichroism, and for centuries, no one understood how it was possible. The answer did not come until modern scientists were able to look at the glass under an electron microscope. What they found was astonishing. The Roman glassmakers had ground gold and silver down into particles so small they measured around 70 nanometers across. A nanometer is 1/1000th of a meter. These particles are so tiny that 1,000 of them lined up would still be thinner than a single human hair. When light hits metal particles at that scale, the electrons in the metal vibrate in a way that depends on the color of the light and the angle it comes from. That is why the cup changes color. Today we have a name for this. It is nanotechnology, the deliberate manipulation of matter at the scale of individual particles. It is one of the defining sciences of the 21st century. The Romans were doing it 1700 years ago. And here is the part that no historian can fully explain. To achieve this effect, the concentration of gold and silver has to be extraordinarily precise. Too much or too little, and the magic does not happen. Out of all the Roman glass that survives, the Lycurgus cup is the only complete dichroic vessel we have ever found. That suggests the Romans could not reliably reproduce it either. It may have been a happy accident, a single perfect batch of glass that no one could make twice. So we have a piece of functioning nanotechnology made by people who had no microscopes, no atomic theory, no way of even knowing the particles were there. They could see the effect, but they could never see the cause. They achieved at the scale of atoms something the modern world only learned to name in our own lifetimes, and then, it seems, they lost the recipe forever. Number 6. The Baghdad Battery, discovered in Iraq in the years before the Second World War. In 1936, near the village of Kujut Rabu, just outside Baghdad, workers uncovered a small clay jar about 14 centimeters tall. Inside was a cylinder of rolled copper sheet, and suspended inside that, held in place by a plug of asphalt, was a rod of iron. The site is close to the ancient capital of Ctesiphon, and the artifact is usually dated to the Parthian or Sasanian period, somewhere between 2000 and 1500 years ago. In 1938, the German director of the National Museum of Iraq, a man named Wilhelm Koenig, examined the jar and proposed a theory that has haunted archaeology ever since. He suggested it was a battery, a galvanic cell, and the design does exactly match one: a copper cylinder, an iron rod, and a ceramic container to hold an electrolyte. Fill that jar with an acidic liquid, vinegar, wine, or fruit juice, and the chemistry is unavoidable. The iron and copper react, and the device produces an electric current somewhere between half a volt and 1 volt. This is not speculation. Modern replicas have been built and tested, and they generate electricity exactly as the theory predicts. So the object works. That much is settled. The mystery is what it was for, and whether anyone, 2,000 years ago, knew what it could do. Koenig speculated it might have been used for electroplating, coating small objects in a thin layer of gold or silver using the current. Others have suggested a mild electric current for medical or religious purposes, a tingling sensation that would have seemed miraculous. But here, mainstream archaeology pushes back hard, and it is important to be fair to that objection. No electroplated object from this period has ever been found. There are no ancient texts describing electricity, no wires, no other components that a real electrical system would need. Many experts believe the jar was never a battery at all, but simply a vessel for storing sacred scrolls, with the asphalt as a seal, and that the resemblance to a battery is a coincidence. And that is exactly why it sits on this list. We have an object that can generate electricity, built 2,000 years before Alessandro Volta is credited with inventing the battery in 1800. We do not know if its makers understood that. We may never know. It either represents a lost chapter of ancient technology or one of the most convincing accidents in the history of archaeology. And the jar itself is not telling. Number 5. The Nebra sky disk, unearthed on a hilltop in Germany. In the summer of 1999, 2 treasure hunters using metal detectors were digging illegally on the Mittelberg Hill near the town of Nebra, in central Germany. They pulled from the ground a bronze disc about 32 centimeters across, weighing just over 2 kilograms with a deep blue-green patina. Set into that dark surface, in gold, were a cluster of dots, a large circle and a crescent. Alongside it were bronze swords, axes, and other tools. The disc dates to around 1600 BC, the early Bronze Age, roughly 3,600 years ago, and it is now widely considered the oldest concrete depiction of the cosmos anywhere in the world. Because those gold symbols are not decoration. They are a map of the sky. There is the sun, or perhaps the full moon. There is a crescent moon, and most tellingly, there is a group of 7 gold dots arranged exactly as the star cluster we call the Pleiades appears in the night sky. The Pleiades were crucial to ancient agriculture, marking the times for planting and harvest. What lifts this beyond a simple picture is what it appears to do. 2 golden arcs were later added along the left and right edges of the disk. Careful measurement showed that each arc spans about 82 degrees, which is precisely the angle between the point where the sun sets on the longest day of the year and the shortest day, as seen from that exact hill in central Germany. In other words, the disk was not just a picture of the sky. It may have been a working instrument for reconciling the solar and the lunar calendars, a genuine astronomical tool. Now, in the interest of honesty, the disk has been at the center of fierce academic debate. Because it was looted rather than excavated by scientists, some researchers even questioned whether it belonged to the Bronze Age at all, suggesting it might be 1,000 years younger. But a detailed interdisciplinary study, published in the journal Archaeologia Austriaca by the Austrian Academy of Sciences, examined the corrosion, the composition, and the archaeological context, and confirmed it. The disk is genuine, and it dates to around 1600 BC. So the debate over its date is settled, but the deeper question is not. 3,600 years ago, in Bronze Age Europe, long before Greece, before Rome, before writing reached that part of the world, someone understood the movement of the heavens well enough to encode it in bronze and gold, not as art, as knowledge, and we still do not fully know who they were, or how far their understanding of the sky really reached. Number 4. Damascus steel, the legendary blades of the medieval Islamic world. For centuries, from roughly the 3rd century AD into the 17th, swordsmiths in the Middle East produced blades from an imported material known as Wootz steel, forged from ingots made in India and Sri Lanka. These weapons became legends. Damascus blades were said to be able to slice through a falling silk scarf, yet also cut through other swords and armor without shattering. Their surface carried a distinctive, flowing, watery pattern, like wind rippling across a pond. They combined two qualities that metallurgists normally consider opposites. They were extraordinarily hard, and yet they were flexible and tough rather than brittle. And then, sometime in the 18th century, the knowledge vanished. The specific ore sources were exhausted or changed. The technique was never fully written down, and the ability to make true Damascus steel was simply lost. For generations, modern metallurgists tried to reproduce it and failed. They could imitate the appearance, but not the true internal structure. The reason why is one of the most remarkable discoveries in the history of materials science. In 2006, a German research team led by Marianne Reibold and Peter Pafler at the Technical University of Dresden published a study in the journal Nature. They dissolved a small sample of a genuine 17th century Damascus sabber in acid and examined what remained under a high-resolution electron microscope. Inside the steel, they found carbon nanotubes, the same cylindrical structures of carbon, just billionths of a meter wide, that today are hailed as a cutting-edge material of the 21st century, prized for their incredible strength. And within those nanotubes were nanowires of cementite, a hard iron carbide. Their theory is that trace impurities in the specific Indian ore, combined with the wood and leaves used as fuel, and the exact heating and cooling cycles of the forge, caused these nanostructures to grow naturally inside the metal. That would explain the impossible combination of hardness and flexibility. It is only fair to note that not every expert agrees. The steel scientist John Verhoeven has argued that the rod-shaped structures might be cementite alone, without true nanotubes. The debate is genuine and ongoing. But strip away the argument over terminology, and this much remains. Craftsmen 1,000 years ago, with no microscopes and no atomic theory, were routinely producing a steel whose performance depended on structures at the scale of nanometers. They could not have known those structures existed. They only knew that if they followed the recipe exactly, the blade came out perfect. And when the ore ran out and the recipe was broken, humanity did not recover that ability for hundreds of years. Number 3. Roman concrete, the material that built an empire and then outlasted every civilization that came after it. Walk through Rome today and you can stand inside the Pantheon, whose vast, unreinforced concrete dome has held itself up for nearly 1,900 years. It is still the largest dome of its kind on Earth. Roman piers and harbor walls have been battered by seawater for 2,000 years and remain standing. Meanwhile, modern concrete, the most used building material on the planet, begins to crack and crumble within decades, and reinforced concrete structures are often considered near the end of their life after 50 to 100 years. For a long time, the explanation focused on a volcanic ash the Romans used, called pozzolana. That is part of the story, but it never fully explained the durability. And there was a persistent oddity that scientists could not account for.
It suggests a
Roman
different
concrete is riddled with small white lumps of lime, called lime clasts. For generations, these were dismissed as evidence of sloppy work, proof that the Romans simply mixed their concrete carelessly. In 2023, a research team led by Professor Adma Masick at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, working with colleagues at Harvard and in Italy, published a study in the journal Science Advances that turned that assumption on its head. Masick never believed the Romans, who built with such precision, would be careless about their most important material. His team analyzed the lime clasts and discovered they had formed at extreme temperatures, close to 400 degrees Celsius. That pointed to a technique called hot mixing, where the Romans used quicklime calcium oxide rather than the gentler slaked lime used today. And this is where the material does something almost alive. Those lime clasts act as a built-in repair system. When a crack forms in the concrete and water seeps in, the water reaches a nearby lime clast and dissolves it, creating a calcium-rich solution. That solution flows into the crack and then recrystallizes, hardening into new mineral that seals the gap. The concrete heals itself. The team demonstrated this in the lab. They deliberately cracked samples of Roman-style concrete, ran water through them, and within 2 weeks, the cracks had sealed and water could no longer pass. Identical samples made without hot mixing never healed at all. So the Romans built a self-healing material 2,000 years ago, and then we forgot how. We spent the last century pouring billions of tons of concrete that crumbles in our lifetimes, while their harbors still stand in the sea. The knowledge was not magic. It was in the mixing, and it took the modern world with electron microscopes and a professor who refused to believe the Romans were careless 2,000 years to finally understand what they had done. Number 2. The Voynich Manuscript, the book that no one on Earth can read. Held today at Yale University in the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library. Catalogued simply as MS-408, it looks at first like an ordinary medieval codex. Around 240 pages of vellum, handwritten, richly illustrated, clearly the product of enormous effort. But open it and the ordinary ends. Every single page is written in a script that appears nowhere else in human history. Flowing, looping characters that form what look like words, sentences, and paragraphs. And in more than a century of study, not one of them has ever been understood. The illustrations only deepen the strangeness. There are pages of botanical drawings showing plants that do not match any known species on Earth. There are astronomical diagrams, circles of stars and suns and zodiac symbols. There are strange biological scenes, tiny human figures bathing in networks of green pools connected by tubes and running around, and beneath all of it, that unreadable text. The obvious assumption would be that it is a hoax, gibberish invented to look mysterious. But the science makes that hard to believe. In 2009, the vellum was radiocarbon dated at the University of Arizona, and the parchment was shown to date to between 1404 and 1438, the early 15th century, with 95% confidence. This was real, expensive medieval calfskin. More troubling still, when linguists have run statistical analysis on the text, the writing behaves like a real language. The frequency of the symbols, the way certain characters cluster together, the length and distribution of the words, all follow the natural mathematical patterns that genuine human languages produce, and that random gibberish usually does not. So it is not obviously nonsense. But it also matches no known language, no known cipher, and no known alphabet. Some of the greatest codebreakers of the 20th century tried and failed, including experts who had cracked military codes in wartime. In our own decade, researchers have turned artificial intelligence and machine learning loose on the text. The AI has found tantalizing patterns and produced hopeful headlines, but no proposed solution has ever held up to scrutiny. Every claimed decipherment collapses under examination. That leaves us with a genuinely disturbing object. A real book, made at real expense, 600 years ago, written fluently and confidently in a language that seems to obey the rules of language, describing a world of plants and stars and creatures that do not exist. Someone knew how to read it. Someone wrote page after page of it, illustrated it, and bound it. And whatever they were trying to say has been sitting in plain sight for 6 centuries, perfectly preserved and completely silent. Number 1. The Antikythera Mechanism. The ancient object that, more than any other, should not exist. We return now to that shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera, where in 1901 divers recovered a corroded, unremarkable lump of bronze and wood. It was set aside while scholars marveled at the statues found in the same wreck. It was not until the object cracked open, and later, until it was studied with X-rays, that the world understood what had been sitting in that drawer. Inside the corrosion was a machine. Not a tool, a machine with a system of more than 30 precisely cut, interlocking bronze gears. It dates to the 2nd century BC, more than 2,000 years ago. For decades, the true scope of it was debated. Then, in 2006, a team called the Antikythera Mechanism Research Project, led by Tony Freeth and his colleagues, published a landmark study in the journal Nature. Using high-resolution X-ray computed tomography, they were able to see through the fused corrosion and read the tiny inscriptions and gear teeth hidden inside. What they revealed rewrote the history of technology. The mechanism was an astronomical calculator. A hand crank on the side turned the gears, and the gears drove pointers across dials on the front and back. It tracked the position of the sun and the moon through the sky. It showed the phases of the moon. It followed the movement of the planets known to the ancient Greeks. It marked the 4-year cycle of the Olympic Games. And most astonishingly, using a dial based on the 223-month Saros cycle, it could predict eclipses of the sun and the moon decades into the future, telling the user not just when an eclipse would come, but whether it would be solar or lunar, and even the likely time of day. To do this, the Greeks had to build gears with teeth cut to a fraction of a millimeter, including at least one gear designed to model the fact that the moon speeds up and slows down as it moves through its orbit. This is not simple clockwork. This is a mechanical model of the cosmos, engineered with a precision that we associate with the scientific revolution. And here is the fact that no historian has ever been able to answer. After this machine sank, nothing of comparable mechanical complexity appears anywhere in the historical record for more than 1,000 years. Not until the astronomical clocks of medieval Europe do we see gearing this intricate again. An entire strand of human knowledge, the ability to build precision-geared machinery, appears fully formed on a shipwreck 2,000 years ago and then simply vanishes from history for a millennium, which forces the real question. The Antikythera mechanism is far too sophisticated to have been a first attempt. Machines like this are not invented perfect. There must have been earlier, simpler versions, a whole tradition of Greek engineering that led up to it. And if there was, where is it? What else did they build that we have never found, that rusted away on some other seafloor, or was melted down for scrap, its knowledge lost with the hands that made it? We found one, by pure chance, in one shipwreck out of the whole ancient world. The mechanism is real, the gears are verified. But the civilization of engineers that must have stood behind it is a story we have almost entirely lost. So think about what we have actually seen. A clay disc from Bronze Age Crete that used the principle of movable type 3,000 years before Gutenberg. A bronze object spread across an empire that left no explanation of itself in any surviving text. An iron pillar in Delhi that has stood in the rain for 16 centuries and refuses to rust. A Roman cup that manipulates light using particles the size of atoms. A clay jar near Baghdad that generates electricity 2,000 years before the battery. A bronze disc from a German hilltop that mapped the movement of the sun and the stars. Swords whose steel contained structures we now call nanotubes. Concrete that heals its own cracks and outlasts everything we build today. A book 600 years old, written fluently, in a language no human can read. And a hand-cranked Greek machine that predicted eclipses across the centuries. Every one of these is real. Everyone has been examined by serious scientists with the best tools we have. And in every case, the deeper the investigation goes, the more the certainty falls away. We can often explain what these objects do. Far more rarely can we explain how the people who made them knew how to do it, or why that knowledge appeared and then disappeared, sometimes for 1,000 years. Because that is the quiet, unsettling thread running through all 10. We tend to imagine history as a straight climb, each generation knowing a little more than the last. But these objects tell a different story. They suggest that knowledge can be found and then lost, that a craftsman can hold a secret in his hands, pass it to no one, and take it into the ground with him. That whole traditions of skill can vanish from the record, leaving behind only a single object that we stumble on by accident centuries later and cannot fully understand. The past, it turns out, is not simpler than we think. In places, it is stranger, and it was cleverer than we ever gave it credit for. Now we want to hear from you. Of all 10 of these, which one unsettles you the most? The machine that predicted eclipses, the book no one can read, or something else on the list? Tell us in the comments, and tell us which artifact you think we should investigate next. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, subscribe, because there are far more of these mysteries out there than most people will ever realize. And the truth is, we have almost certainly only found a fraction of them.